So hopefully this is now going to work. It's been one of those days. Just waiting for the stream to come on. We have the green light. Yes, we do. We do. Fantastic. So hello coders, hope you're all well. Today I'm going to be teaching the arrow functions in JavaScript ES6. Like it or not, they are here in ES6. It's kind of like one of those sort of Marmite sort of situations. You either like it or you don't like it. I didn't like arrow functions when they first came out, simply because I just thought they were syntax sugar. However, there are some certain use cases of arrow functions that actually work quite well. And if they're used in the right way, they're actually really, really good. So what we're going to do today is I'm just going to talk about arrow functions and I'll demonstrate what they are. And then we're going to be using them in different scenarios and stuff. Apologies for being so late. I had some tremendous issues with the audio here, and I wanted to make sure that the audio was working before I went live. So if anybody can let me know if the audio is coming out okay, just put your thoughts down in the comments. And hopefully the audio is working and is fine. If it isn't working, however, then what I'll do is I will remove this live video after it's been processed, and I'll do it again at another date. Also, apologies as well for missing last week. I am still recovering from a cold, and I didn't particularly want to be coughing and spluttering on the microphone. Also, I was pretty rough, so for like a couple of days I was laid up in bed. So I've got a mountain of work that I need to get on and do anyway because of that, but I just wanted to get on and do some teaching. So JavaScript ES6 arrow functions is what I'm going to be teaching today. Let's just take a look at what a normal JavaScript function looks like. What I've got here is just WebStorm running. And what I can do is let's just bring that over here. Just bear with me a minute whilst I get everything sorted out. Okay, so let's just create a simple function. We're just going to do function, let's just call this shout, like so. And the parentheses in here, the parameter that we're going to supply, or the argument that we're going to supply, let's just supply, let's just do name, and then let's just do a return of name dot what is it, to uppercase. So what this is doing is it's simply just taking the string and then returning everything in uppercase, so it will basically shout it out. So let's just do a simple console.log of shout, whoops, sorry, there we go, shout, passing in the name. I'm just going to put in my name, so all lowercase, whoops, like so. Let's save that. Okay, let's just run this and we should see the name Pete, but all uppercase, because we've done up to uppercase. Now let's just take a look at this function for a minute. You might think, oh well, this is terribly simple, and it is. But let's just work simply first, and then I'll get into more of a complicated scenario later on. So this is 3 lines of code. This function, and it's 3 lines of code simply because, well, the first line is the function declaration. So we have function and then shout, so that's the name of the function. Then we have some parentheses here, and in the parentheses we're passing in the argument, which is a string, and then we close that off using the curly brace. Now within the actual the body of the function, we then return the string, but that goes to uppercase, and then on the 3rd line we then close that off by having the closing curly brace. And then, of course, on line 6 here, we're then calling that shout method. Now, really, this is actually quite a lot of code just to do that. And the arrow functions allow us to simplify this by not having, or basically condensing down on removing all of this street furniture, if you will. Now, the danger, of course, in doing that is that you actually make the code less readable. But we'll be talking about that in more detail later on in this video, in this live stream. So I'm just going to just double check a couple of things before I progress. Just bear with me a minute. As I said, I'm still getting over this cold, so I do apologize. Okay, so let's now take a look at how we can actually handle this. Let's go back to WebStorm. Using arrow functions. I just want to make sure, yep, you can see all of that. That's good. Okay, so what I'm going to do right at the top here is I'm going to just do console.log. Let's just do example1, because what I want to do is just set the stage, because there's going to be lots of examples that I'm going to go through. And I'm just going to put in some comments. So example1, like so. Okay. So this is now example1. And this is example1 old. And I'm going to now do example1 new. Okay, so this is showing you how to do it the old way and the new way. There we go. Okay, so the new way is to reduce the amount of street furniture that we've got here. Say, for example, the actual keyword function, and also the parentheses here. We don't need those, and also the braces. So to simplify this, we can use something like, and what I'll do is I'll just put it down first, and then we'll adapt it to this example. So we can do something like let function is equal to, or let's just do f is equal to, and then what we do is we pass in params, and then we do an arrow function like this, and then params dot, and then perhaps to uppercase. Now that might look a little strange, and I do appreciate that, but what we're basically saying is f is the function that we're assigning. We pass in some parameters, and in this case it would be the name, it's a string, and then that is going to go params dot to uppercase. Now notice that this basically replaces that. So you're actually condensing down and removing a lot of the street furniture. You don't need to have the function, you don't need to have the parentheses when you're doing it like this. And I'll talk about the different use cases in just a second. So in this case, we could call this shout, shout it, okay, and then the params that we're going to shout, excuse me, we can do something like, we can then pass that in. So for example, we can do shout it, and we pass in the params being the string that we want to shout. So let's do Jack or Jake, for example, and that's going to return that. So let's do console.log. There we go. So let me just run this, and then I'll explain what on earth this is doing in just a second. So let's just save that. Run this. So in the old example up here, we had a function we declared like so. This is the standard old ES6 way of declaring a function. And we simply return a string with to upper. Okay, and then what we did is on line 7 is we just output that. So we output the return of shout to this. Whereas in the new example, what we're doing is we're creating this arrow function here. And we're saying that shout it is the return of this arrow function. Whereas params would be the params that we put in here. Can you see that my IDE has pick that up as params. Whoops. So let's just say, for example, this is so it does, params is kind of a weird thing to call it because there's only one parameter. So let's just do word, and then word like so. So that doesn't matter. This is just the parameter that you're supplying, and what that's doing is it's returning that. Okay. So what we've done is we've reduced these 3 lines of code to this. And you might be thinking, hang on a minute, this is crazy because what you've just achieved is something that can be completely misused because this in this case makes sense, but you start having more and more parameters to it, and you start reducing what perhaps the variable names are. So maybe they're, instead of word, they're just W. Then it gets really confusing. So I certainly don't recommend you do that. Okay, so let's just I'm just double checking the old code and stream and everything. Everything seems to be running smoothly, and the microphone seems to be picking up still, which is always good. What we could do here, instead of just saying shout, we could literally do var, or let's just do let shout is equal to that. That's exactly the same. All we're doing is we're saying that this is called shout. It's the variable. That's fine. So let's just run this. So that's more like how this works. So we've got shout it and shout. So this shout it replaces shout. So this is the first example. I've got lots of examples that I want to show you. The next example is an example where we're having multiple parameters. This is only one parameter, and you can get away with not having parentheses because you've only got one parameter. However, when you've got more than one parameter, you're going to have parentheses. So let's say, for example, let's just create a new example. For example, so example 2, let's do the old way. Let's say, for example, what we wanted to do is create a function that would increase based on a multiplier. So, for example, we could have a variable in the global scope, and we're going to call this counter, whoops, like so. And we're going to just set that to be the value, whoops, of 0. Okay, and then what we need to do is have a function, and we're going to call this function increase, like so. It's going to take, we're going to take 2 parameters this time. One is the amount. The other one is a multiplier, if I can spell that. Multiplier. Is that the right spelling? Maybe not. It's got an I in there. There we go. Got there in the end. Okay, so we have a function. We call it increase. I'm going to just change that to 2. There you go. 2, not 3. So we have a function called increase, and what we're going to do is we're going to increase the counter by the amount, and then we're going to times it by the multiplier. So in this case, we can do counter is equal to counter plus, whoopsie, plus the amount times by multiplied by the multiplier. Okay, so we've got this counter here. We are adding the amount to the counter, and then we're multiplying it. Pretty standard stuff. So what we can do now is we can do increase, and we can say 3 and 2, right? So that's going to add 3 to 0, and then it's going to times that by 2, so that should become 6. And then what we could do, I guess, because that isn't returning, I guess what we could do is just do a console.log of counter. So this is example 2 old. Let's just run that. Hopefully this will work. There we go. So we have 6. So again, let's just change that to be 4. That should now be 8. Yep, that's cool. Let's bring that down to 6 again. And also what we can do is we can have an increase of, again, and we can do, say, 1 and 2, and that should just change that to be 14. Fine. Okay. So we've, so just bear with me a minute. So, okay, so we've got this this increase function. It takes 2 parameters, and the amount and the multiplier. And all we're doing is we're adding the amount to the counter, and then we are multiplying that. Fine, and we can call this as many times as we wish. That's perfectly acceptable. Let's now try and do this in the new ES6 arrow functions kind of way, where we need to have two parameters. So we can't do it like we did here, because this only has 1 parameter, and we couldn't have a new parameter without using parentheses. So in that case, what we need to do, let's just do console 3. Sorry, console example 2 new. Oops. What we can do is we can have let. We can have a function. We're going to call this increase. Increase it, and then we're going to equal that to something, right? And then we're going to have an arrow function that returns something, right? So we're going to equal that to the parameters, and then we're going to return this. So let's just copy that like so. And what we need to do is we need to supply both the amount and we need to supply the multiplier. Just going to copy that. I'm not going to even attempt to try and spell that again. Let's just bring this out a little bit just to give you a little bit more room. So, okay. This is where it gets a little bit complicated because, you know, notice I've had to drag this down. It's making this line very long. So there is a case, if you wish, for saying, well, these arrow functions are actually making things less easy to read. And what you could do is you could then say, well, that should be A, that should be M, and that should be C, right? And then it's like, well, what does that represent? But let's just talk about that in just a second. Let's just see if we can actually run this and get this to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment out this for now because that will run. In fact, what I could do is just have var counter new, set that to 0. There we go. Okay. So let's save that, and then let's now do a console.log of counter new. And what I want to do is I want to increase it by both 6 and multiply that by 2. And again, we're going to increase it by 1 and by 2. So this should be exactly the same as it was before. So let's just double check what I've got here. So the amount and the multiplier, these are the 2 parameters that we're supplying to this arrow function. So 6 and 2, 6 and 2, yep. What we're doing is we're saying, well, counter new, which is set to 0 by standard, is equal to counter new plus the amount multiplied by the multiplier. So that 6 and 2 and then 1, and then so that will work that one out, and then that will add that and work that one out. Okay, so let's just save this. I'll run this again. So we now have 14 and 14. So They're exactly the same. It's doing exactly the same thing. It's just we've changed line 31 to be an arrow function, whereas up here we have the standard function. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, this is easier to read, right? This here, increase, this, we can see what it's doing. It's increasing. And we pass in two parameters, the amount and the multiplier. Okay, next line. Our eyes are drawn to the next line, so we can actually see what's going on in the next line. Whereas down here, it's like, oh my gosh, like, you know, this is going to be more difficult to understand. And this was my problems with arrow functions. Right when I was looking at arrow functions, I was like, what? This is crazy. Why are we making it more complicated? And then I saw this. So whoops. We're going to have A, we're going to have M, we're going to have C, we're going to have C, and we're going to have A, and we're going to have M, and then we're going to have C up here, right? And it's like, this is so confusing. It will work just the same. Let's just put that down to C here. It will work, and it's perhaps it's obviously smaller, but there isn't anything that actually gives these variables any kind of context. So you wouldn't know that M was the multiplier until you actually read the code, right? So what if that was M and what if that was A, that kind of thing. So let's just save that and run this again. So what I'm basically trying to say is don't do that. Don't do that, because personally, it's personal preference, right? But personally, I find that this is more readable than that. And this is only a very small example, right? All we're doing is we're adding a number, and then we're multiplying it. It's not difficult. It's not like a really complicated thing. However, these things can get very, very complicated very, very fast. So I'll leave that as is, just to give you an example of how complicated these things can look. Because personally, I think this looks more complicated than it is actually doing, right? It's actually trying to achieve. However, a lot of you might be thinking, no, this is fine. This is perfect. But let's just imagine if we needed to have a third parameter in there. What are we going to do? We're going to call that B or something, and then now you've gone and really changed. You've made it very sort of mathematical. It's very equation based, and for me personally, I like to have the word amount. I like to have the word multiplier because it says exactly what it should do. So when I started looking at arrow functions, I actually thought that they weren't the greatest thing. And I also thought that they were basically allowing programmers to write terrible code more easily. However, saying that, I've used arrow functions far more recently, and I really do like arrow functions now. Partly because of the thing with the this. This is the next example that I'm going to show you. So let's just scroll down a little bit. Here, let's just do console. Let's just, yeah, I'm just going to grab that. Example 3. Old. So, just going down my notes. Right, so basically with these arrow functions, you can't use the this because they can't be bound to the scope that they're used within. And you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, that's just nuts. Why are you doing? Why is that? But in actual fact, it makes things a little bit more easier to use, I think, in certain circumstances. I'll give you an example. So let's say, for example, you have console. Oh, no, not console. Let's say you have var walker. Var walker. This is going to be an object literal, like so. And we're going to have this walker is going to do some steps, right? And the steps are going to be set by to 0 at the first. So think of this like one of those pedometers, those things that calculate the amount of steps that you do every day, right? So it's like something that you have on your watch. And we can have a method in here called move, right? And we could move this like like this, right? So you could have move, and then you could do, and then you would think that you could do this steps plus plus. However, if I was to do console.log walker, .move, or .steps, I should say, and then above here I do walker.move. So the steps should increment, right? Because I've said that the walker needs to move, and then I'm logging that out. So I'm just going to set, this is actually the new, and that's new. I'll do the old one in just a minute, just to show you what I mean. So let's save that, run this. It's actually set to 0. Why is it set to 0 when we've told it to move? I mean, let's see if we can move it again and again. Still set to 0. What is going on? Well, we can only use this in this current scope. We cannot use this to assign to access this scope. That's the beauty of having this. It doesn't bind to what you would think it would bind to, which is good in my opinion. That's the win. That's a win. Now the old way. Let's just do the old way. So the old way, and I'll talk about why it's a good thing in just a second. Right, walker, steps, move, blah blah blah. This isn't going to be an arrow function. It's just going to be a function. And we're going to do walker, let's just do walker A, right? So that's the new one, that's fine. So that's the old way, and I'm just going to grab that to here. So console.log walker A steps, and what we need to do is walker A .move. Run this, and what we've got here is 1, and let's just run it again and again. This should now be 3, and again that should now be 4, but this is only 0. What's going on? Well, what you're doing is you're not binding this is not being bound. Oops, if you're using an arrow function. Sorry, what have I done? There we go. So I've done it again. Save. That's what I want to do, not Z. So, okay, so basically what's happening is that when you're doing an arrow function, you can't use the context of the parent scope, right? So you can't use this of walker, but you can do it within here. Right, so for example, if you did this dot A is equal to 29, you can do console dot this dot A, right? So you could do that, but you could also have A up here, and you could set that to be 42 or 42, right? But actually you've got it in this, so you're dealing with the context within here. So let's save that and run this, and see what happens. So you've got 29. And it's being called more than once because we're running it more than once. Move, move, move. So we have 29, 29, 29. So this means that these functions are anonymous. They are anonymous because they're not bound to whatever they are running within, right? So you can't sort of references are not the right word, but you can't use the parameters that are set against this parent object, object literal, because even though we've got a as 42 here, this is going to supersede that. In fact, if I was to remove that from here and run that again, we'll have undefined, 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 because it's not defined within the context of this arrow function. So that is like the most important point, I think, of arrow functions, is that you have to be very careful as to what you're doing with this. And I think what I'll need to do is have a tutorial or even a course, because there's so much involved, about this in JavaScript, and actually pull it apart and talk about how this is actually used and how it has been used in previous iterations of JavaScript, and how it's evolving now to be more constrained as to when you can use it and when you can't use it, and all about objects and stuff. I suppose I should really do a course specifically on JavaScript objects and object orientation and stuff like that. And maybe I'll do that. I don't know. If you're interested in that, though, do let me know. We've got one more example to show you. So I'm just going to scroll down. We're on line 66 already. That's a lot of code written today. Just bear with me just a sec. Okay, so the other example is around timers, because timers are one of these crazy things that confuse me, right? They confuse a lot of people. They are not the easiest thing to do, and it kind of, on the face of it, contradicts this Walker example. I'll explain as I go. So, what are we on? Example 3. Let's do example 4. Yeah, that's fine. So, okay. So we could have a variable called timer, and we could equal that to, again, another object, and we could set time to be 0. So it's very similar to the other example where we had Walker. And then we could have a method, and we could call that start, right? And we could say that is a function. Let's just call it start. I'm just making this up as I go. I have a couple of notes, but nothing massive. So I'm surprised that this hasn't thrown an error already. So let me get this right. So it's set interval. That's the badger, and it takes a function. So this is what it used to do. Take a function. Whoopsie. And we would also supply an interval. So let's just do 1,000 milliseconds. And then what we could do is console.log this .time, right? So for every second, it's just going to go 0, 0, 0. So what we could do to make it a little bit more better is we could do timer plus plus, right? So that's just incrementing that. And then we could do console.log. Oh, actually, before we do that, console.log timer .time. And then we could do timer.start to start the timer. So we're starting the timer, and then what it's going to do is for every for every 1,000 milliseconds, you know, it will then increment the timer by well, by 1 really. So let's just run this. I'm going to just set that to be old. And what we should get is, ooh, not a numbers. That's not good. What's going on here? Var timer. It's a handler of a function. That seems to be all good. Okay, let's just play with this in the new world. I probably just confused it. So in the new world, what we do is we set the interval by using an empty arrow function like so. And then that goes to console.log this timer, which is set to 0. But because we're incrementing it in here, right, because we're in the here, this is the point I want to make. Because we're in here, we're not outside, and therefore this is being incremented. That's basically what I wanted to say. So let's run this. Is it because of that? Let's just run that again. Nope, that isn't working. Timer start. Whoops. 2 seconds. Okay, yeah. So it's still 0, and it's because it can't update that. That was the get there in the end. That was the problem. Whereas before in the new world, sorry, I should have said that. In the new world, you would have to bind that to it, right? Because you can't change the scope of this. However, let's say for example, we had var or let a and then we would put a in here, and then that would increment. So that would work because it's within that scope. But basically, what I wanted to show you is that you know, I've done it in a very bad way. But both of these examples are very similar in the sense that you can't access this within the scope outside of what you're dealing with. Okay. And with intervals, it's a bit weird because with intervals you're doing things on a timer, which means that the actual the variables get referenced at different times, or at least they get accessed at different times, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to remove this example because it's a bit of a bad one, really, and just focus on this one above. What I'll do is I'll just do a quick recap of the whole thing, and then I'll talk you through the pros and cons. So, okay, so let's just pull up this all apart again. So we have this here, a simple shout method, and that is just returning a string, and it takes the string that you've sent it, and it's just returning it to uppercase. There's you know, that's not as very complicated at all, and we're literally just consoling that out. So we change Pete to be Pete, all uppercase. Scroll down here. We have this variant, which is in the arrow function. So we're passing in word, and we're also passing that to the uppercase string. This line 12 replaces these 3 lines. That is, in my opinion, a good use case because you're doing a single thing on that parameter, and you're returning it. Scrolling down a little bit, we have the example where we were using 2 parameters. And because we're using 2 parameters, we need to have parentheses around. So we have the increase, the increase function takes the amount and the multiplier. And I also had the example here of where you can have, you can just use single variable letters to represent what you're trying to do. But as I said, I don't think that is terribly readable, and I don't recommend doing such a thing, because even though this isn't actually terribly complicated, just imagine if this was to get even more complicated down the road. Then we have this example where we have two walkers. We have walker A and then just walker. Before, what we did is we had this object with a method within that object called move. We set the steps to be 0, and then every time we called move, we would increment steps by 1. Now this would work, right, in the old way, because we have access to this being this.steps. However, it doesn't work in the new world because we don't have access to this. It's a bit like static, if that makes sense. So on this example, we're using this arrow functions here. Notice, actually, I should have mentioned that we're actually using these brackets. And we could use brackets as well up here, right? So we could do brackets like this if we really wanted to. But we don't have to. We don't have to. This example is just showing you how sort of minimal you can go. Well, to be honest, up here, where is it here? That is as minimal as you can get. I mean, that could just be W, right? Scrolling down a little bit further, we have the example of the walker where you simply couldn't do that. And I had another example of using timeouts, but let's not get too worried about that too much. So when would I use arrow functions, and when would I just stay clear of them? Well, I would stay clear of them if I was to do anything like this, for example, because when I look at code, I want to be looking at code and reading it. I want to be reading it like I'm reading a book, right? And to me, the actual variable names called amount and multiplier, they make more sense to me than just A and M, because that doesn't make any sense. From someone who doesn't understand the code straight away, that is a bit complicated in my opinion. So I wouldn't use it like that. I also wouldn't be using it where I needed to use this, right? So, for example, I wouldn't be using it if I was to deal with any kind of perhaps events, right? Where I'm triggering something like a on-click type stuff, because you lose the context of this. Where I would use it, however, is where I would be using things like array map or array walk, or these maybe some randomization functions. So if I was to do it like a number counter and I wanted to randomize that, or if I wanted to randomize a password or a string, that kind of thing, where you could literally just string together a bunch of parameters, a bunch of functions against the parameter, and then return it, where the actual parameters inside the function don't need to reference anything outside of that. That is where I would use it. And in actual fact, I'm using it far more these days, and I'm less. So see, when this first came out, I was a bit like, ooh, this is just syntax sugar for syntax sugar's sake. But actually, I'm actually starting to think and using it more often, and actually appreciating it. Once you start to understand the confines it has with using this and its context. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to teach today. If you've got any questions, if you've got any comments, then do let me know. Put your thoughts down in the comment section below. Again, I'm very sorry for the delay in this, and also I'm sorry for missing last week. But if you haven't done so already, please do check out the other live streams. I did one live coding stream on ES6 variables, variable scopes. I did another one on constants. This one's on arrow functions. The next one, which will be in 2 weeks' time, will be on other parts of ES6 as well. There's a lot more things that we can talk about with functions. I mean, they even have default parameters these days. So I might be doing a tutorial on that as well. Also, if you haven't done so already, please do check out the podcast. The podcast gets updated every week, so there's a new one coming on Friday. So do check that one out. I'll put links in all of this in the description down below. But thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I will see you again in the next live coding stream. Cheers. Bye.